am the ballad sings. And my voice is of the streets and the cantinas and the dance halls and all the places where I am heard. For I am the soul of the common people that sings of tragedies and melancholy, but also happiness. Ahora, muchachos, adentro! One of my primary inspirations was Bertolt Brecht, who used to, in the 1920s, put together small plays, which in German, I believe, are called Lernstücke, learning plays. And I've never had a problem trying to teach people through the use of the theater. As a matter of fact, I've taught in the classroom, and any classroom teacher will tell you, you have to act in order to keep your students interested. So that merging of theater with teaching and learning is a very natural collaboration. And my plays at the very beginning, when I started working with Cesar Chavez for the farm workers, were learning plays.
I am Joaquin. The odds are great, but my spirit is strong. My faith unbreakable. My blood is pure. I am Aztec prince and Christian Christ. I shall endure. I will endure.
We are El Teatro Campesino, the farm workers' theater of Delano, of the Great Strike, of the Chicano movement, of the Raza, the farm workers' theater of Aztlán, of the Southwest, of America, of the earth, the farm workers' theater of the universe.
What's happening?
Perhaps the best-known work of Luis Valdez is his screenplay and direction of La Bamba.
Para bailar la bamba, para bailar la bamba, se necesita una poca de gracia.
And most significant, his play, Zoot Suit, which he premiered in a sellout Los Angeles production, took to Broadway, and turned into a movie in 1981.
Hey man, you call that dancing?
Doing Zoot Suit with Luis Valdez was literally the launching point of my artistic understanding. Working with Luis at that point was quite an experience. It was like nothing I'd ever gone through before because there had really never been a playwright of this stature.
Zoot Suit remains the only play ever written and directed by a Chicana or a Chicano on Broadway.
Canto alegrías, tragedias y penas.
Fury! I am so embarrassed I could spit. Now, do you honestly think that those people killed my firstborn son?
You want to see my green card, Mr. Citizen? I'll show you my green card!
Ready? Aim! Fire!
After you, Padre.
No, my son, after you.
No, please,
after you, my son.
And through it all, sharing the hard times and the triumphs, right by his side has been his partner in theater and in life, Lupe Valdez.
I tell Lupe, and she's approaching 60, but the thing is that I tell her, you'll always be 24 to me. Seriously, she's always going to be 24 to me, and it doesn't matter what happens. I have a very intense relationship with my sons. As a father, And I must say, also as a brother almost, and the very issues in this play, is he my father, is he my brother, reflects my way of life. I don't consider myself to be superior to my sons just because I was, you know, they're fruit of my loins, you know. They're my equals, I'm their equal. I mean, I hope that they can see my humanity, they can see my struggles. I certainly consult them now. They're my colleagues in the work. They're my partners in the Teatro Campesino.
I do think of my father as a pioneer, somebody who's carved the space. I think the legacy he's given us is a path to walk on when none existed before.
So plays are like kernels of corn, you know. They have found ancient kernels of corn in the Americas. All you have to do is add water and you can make tortillas, you know, you got it.
And so, amigos, el corrido goes on. It shall remember even you and me. Adios, amigos.
I'd like to introduce my compañera. You saw her in the video, and she's here with me today, Lupe Trujillo Valdez. Lupe, stand up, please. Lupe is one of the founding members of El Teatro Campesino. She joined in 1968. Actually, we met in 1966 when we had the Farm Workers March from Delano, the grape strike headquarters, all the way to Sacramento, 360 days, and we literally came to her hometown. And El Teatro Campesino was in charge of the nightly rallies, and we set up the truck, and that's where we met, in that park. And then later, when I began teaching at Fresno State, she was one of my students. She was about to graduate, you know. Then she graduated. She graduated and then joined El Teatro Campesino, and then we were married in 69. So we've been married for 46 years. You saw our 3 sons. They're all in the theater. But in a sense, we need to speak of El Teatro Campesino as a large family in itself. We're a family of families, and so our core, our leadership core, has been together for roughly 40 years, you know, on average. And they have children, their children, including my brother's children, have also become involved in El Teatro Campesino. We are really subscribing to an idea that Cesar Chavez passed on to us, because he used to talk about how long it was going to take to achieve social justice. And he said, you know, it's going to take longer than a single lifetime. He says, he had a wonderful saying. He said, hay más tiempo que vida. There's more time than life. And also he used to say that the poor have no money, but they have time. So if you combine those two ideas, that we're working really through time, then it becomes really necessary to talk in terms of generations. And so El Teatro Campesino is into its 3rd generation, into the grandchildren. And they're not so little anymore, and some of them are also beginning to perform as musicians and as actors and as writers. And we look forward to seeing the flame passed, the torch being passed from one generation to the other, because it really is going to take more than a single lifetime in order to achieve our dreams of social justice and our dreams of social change. It is important that we exist and work with the whole idea, the concept, the richness of culture, and that we see ourselves as cultural activists, because in many ways culture is pre-political, and it deals with some basic commonalities among human beings, because you relate to the very experience of life itself, from birth to death, from the cradle to the grave. And so storytellers that deal in the arts, that deal in the theater specifically, that deal with literature, are really tuned in to the lifeline of all human beings. And so El Teatro Campesino, through its cultural activism, has explored the humanity of farm workers, and then not just farm workers. Because in the final analysis, even though we call ourselves El Teatro Campesino, we are really children of the earth, all of us. And we can't afford to forget that. The moment that we think that we're so sophisticated or so urbanized or so technological that we forget to put seeds in the ground, we're in trouble. We must feed humanity through the miracle of agriculture. And the miracle of agriculture requires a miracle of farm workers. And so our whole idea of El Teatro Campesino is really global, and it really transcends all professions. It's something that concerns all of us. We should all be concerned about where our food is coming from and how it is that that food is grown. You know, there's a lot of controversy around the world about GMOs, you know, genetically modified foods, and that's a concern also. But it started even before that with the use of pesticides. In 1988, Cesar fasted for 36 days. That was his last major fast. Some of us believe that, in fact, it actually led to his early death 5 years later. Because, again, 36 days is a long time, and it used to affect him very, very directly. He took about 9 months to recover from that last fast. But he was fasting against the use of pesticides at a time when people were beginning to forget and ignore the issues in the 1960s. We have seen a fundamental change in the country with respect to attitudes toward farm workers. When we began 50 years ago in 1965, there was a lot more compassion in the country. The country was prosperous, was functioning very, very well. Unfortunately, also due to the Vietnam War, which was providing a lot of jobs. So the general public was willing to look toward farm workers with compassion and to help them in the Great Boycott. And so consequently, the first union contracts involving farm workers were signed on the basis of a very successful national boycott of grapes, you know, the boycott grape campaign from approximately 1966 until 1970, when the contracts were signed. That began to change. That began to change with new immigration. And so now we exist in a time where these so-called undocumented workers, these illegal immigrants, these aliens, who are really coming across to take whatever jobs they can find over here, many of them farm workers, are looked at with a certain amount of disdain in the general public and no compassion whatsoever. No concern at all if they die crossing the desert, you know, without water. No concern if they're men, women, children, doesn't matter. There are people wanting to build that big wall, you know, 2,000 miles from Tijuana all the way down to Matamoros, you know, and down to Brownsville to block out these farm workers. But the fact is that farm labor is still being done by people that have no choice but to do farm labor. And of the history of agriculture in California has always relied on immigrant labor. They tried to impose it when agriculture developed in the 19th century here, after the gold rush. First, the gold rush imported 100,000 people, so that they needed to be fed. So agriculture developed in the Santa Clara Valley by San Jose to feed the people who were coming to the gold rush. And they tried to use Native American labor, and the Native Americans were never any good at slave labor. And they just refused or died off and couldn't do it. The priests found that out when they were establishing the missions. So they brought in Asian labor. And so the first big wave was the Chinese who came off of the railroad, working the railroads, and into the fields. And then from there, they also imported Japanese. There were all these alien exclusion laws to also limit the circulation of Asians. The Filipinos came in, and then finally the Mexicans. And with the Mexicans, agriculture developed a constant source of cheap, stoop labor that was just across the border. Even though, of course, Mexicans had been here from the very beginning. I mean, this was Mexico. And so, but the big waves of workers, of wage slaves, did not start until the 20th century. And so that created a condition in agriculture that spread into Southern California to the growth of the citrus industry, which you see around here, from San Bernardino all the way to Los Angeles, the whole citrus belt. And this was a very, very prosperous area, but Mexicans were living on riverbanks. You know, they were living in Hicks Camp. They were living in the jungle. I'm sure if you know your Mexican-American history, you know that about Marrano Beach, for instance, you know, which was, again, Chicanos used to go swimming in the rivers because they weren't allowed in the public pools. Well, these were farm workers living in and among the trees, but picking the citrus, picking the oranges and picking the lemons. And also some Filipinos were also, great waves of Filipinos were used in the development of the citrus industry. California then developed on the basis of its agriculture and on the basis of its farm labor population. And today, a multi-billion-dollar industry exists in this country that is tantamount to what you see in aerospace and what you see in the movies. There's agriculture. Agriculture is one of the main sustaining industries. And frankly, Americans in general don't want to go out in the fields, especially in an area like this in the summer when it's hot. And you can get 100 degrees out. Who's going to go out there? Only the very desperate. And so really,
the idea of farm labor, the idea of achieving justice in the fields is something that continues to be a vital and living issue. And so you who are university students, I think have a responsibility to learn more about this, to learn where our food comes from, and also to share that knowledge with your community, because it's only through coordinated efforts that we'll even begin to see any justice in the fields. In the last 50 years, the United Farm Workers have had some tremendous successes, but also some tremendous rollbacks, so that there's been losses, and there have been gains and then losses at the same time. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. El Teatro Campesino continues to participate in this struggle, although its work through cultural activism has opened up the horizons and our understanding of what the world is about and how to deal with it. And education has become one of our prime subjects, almost from the very beginning, from the 1960s. When we were touring the colleges, we became aware that we needed also to activate for Chicano studies or Mexican American studies and ethnic studies in general. So we participated in some of the early protests on all of these campuses, insisting that we needed to set new curriculum on the books, for students to have access to. And as a matter of fact, I taught one of the first Mexican-American culture classes in 1968, and my wife was one of my first students. So, this was at Fresno State, and we lasted 2 years before the whole department was fired. We had a new college president come in, and then we were all just wiped out. And the arguments were basically the same ones you hear coming from Arizona today, that we were unqualified, that we were distorting history, that we're teaching anti-Americanism, all of which, of course, was a lot of BS. Because really what we were trying to do was open up the scope of American history. What we're talking about is American history. It is what's been happening, in not only just the continental United States, but also America as a hemisphere. And so that became one of our major thrusts in the 1960s to establish ethnic studies, and also to embrace other cultures, that we should have Asian studies, we should have African American studies, and really we should have European studies from a different perspective. And because all of these are cultures, the so-called Anglos are not all Anglos. Some are French. Many of them are Jewish. And the Jews can be anybody. They can be Spanish, they can be English, they can be Russian, they can be Mexican, they can be Argentinian. That's a cross-cultural sort of nexus culture. And at the same time, any of the immigrant peoples coming from Europe 100 years ago experienced the same kind of discrimination. So if you were Bulgarian, or if you were Italian, if you were French, if you were, the French had a little bit better, French and English, because they were major powers in the world a long time ago. But the other European peoples had to acculturate, they had to assimilate 100 years ago in the United States. And many of those Americans with those immigrant groups lost a sense of who they were. Frankly, they forgot either their Polish past, or they forgot their Russian past, and they became, Americans. And our belief is that America should be rich, absolutely rich on a human level, because of the multiplicity of the cultures that have gone into creating Americans, because of the multiplicity of influence that have gone into creating our American identity. So instead of wiping it out, we should be incorporating, the richest parts of all of these cultures in order to create a new, sophisticated people that are globally wise and sophisticated and compassionate to other peoples in the world. The process is going on with all of the people from the Middle East, the whole Muslim thing. The whole Muslim thing is no different than what was happening with other groups and other cultures in the past, including other Christian groups, by the way. John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic president in the history of the United States. And I'm happy to say that I worked on the John F. Kennedy campaign. Back in 1960, when I was a college student, I worked on the Viva Kennedy campaign in San Jose, California. And I met John F. Kennedy. He looked healthy to me. He was a big, ruddy guy. Not that big, but I mean, he was very ruddy and healthy looking, handsome guy with all the bushy hair. And I was part of MAPA, that was called the Mexican American Political Association. And I did precinct work for the Viva Kennedy campaign for the 1960 election, even though I couldn't vote then, because the vote, you had to be 21 to vote in 1960. That later changed, allowing 18-year-olds, and some of you then are going to vote for the first time, and I encourage you to become voters. Don't disregard that. But anyway, I went to work for John F. Kennedy, and so when he was assassinated 3 years later, it shocked me to my roots. It shocked me to the very basis of my being, because I had known the man. You know, we presented him with a big Mexican sombrero, you know, one of those charro hats, you know, and he wouldn't put it on, but he said that he was going to wait and wear it at the St. Patrick's Day parade in New York City, you know. Of course, it was a great political joke. He was a great guy. So, but the thing is that all of that, the hope and the uplift, you know, of the Kennedy administration with Jackie Kennedy and Caroline and John, all of that was very uplifting in the early 60s, and all of that got dashed to the ground in 1963, November 22nd, when he was assassinated, and it really just crushed me. It radicalized me. It said, what's going on? And then later, when books came out that suspected the CIA had done it, it was even worse. You know, I said, it requires activism. We've got to become involved, you know. But, you know, John F. Kennedy was Irish. And he had not completely lost, his family had not lost their Irish quality. And so along comes Robert F. Kennedy, and so he became a friend of the farm workers. He flew into Delano, California at the beginning of the Great Strike in 1966. He was part of the Agricultural Committee on Migratory Labor. He came to investigate conditions, and he became a friend of the farm workers. So I later, and El Teatro later went to work on his campaign in 1968 when he was running for president. And in the California primary, he did a whistle-stop campaign up and down the San Joaquin Valley, and we were on the train with him singing, and he would introduce us. He also sponsored us, by the way, in Washington, D.C. El Teatro Campesino performed inside the Senate courtyard of the U.S. Capitol building in 1967. We were sponsored by Robert Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy. I don't know how many groups have had that privilege, but we're the farm workers, and so we came in and performed, and this was our testimony before the migratory labor. So we were real friends, you know, with Bobby Kennedy. But the fact is that he too then was shot down at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968. And that also potentially completely embittered us, you know. It was, how could this happen again? And then of course Martin Luther King had been assassinated shortly before that. So the country was literally going crazy in 1968. Our only salvation within the teatro was to go back into the culture, is to go back into music, to go back into the arts, and try to find some way to recapture our peace of mind so we could continue to work. But we never lost the sense that we had to continue to do what we were doing in order to spread hope and faith, you know, in the human race with all of our audiences. And at the same time, push the fact that Americans are blessed with the possibility of drawing and distilling from the whole human race our sense of humanity. And American culture should be a lot more rich. So ethnic studies was not just about putting down white people and putting up ethnic groups. That wasn't what it was about. It was about questioning the whole existence of the melting pot and what that melting pot was going to do. Instead of breaking peoples down into some kind of mush, let's draw. Let's draw from the essences of everybody and make ourselves as rich as possible. You know, I'm an American, like I grew here. I was born in Delano, California in 1940. Delano and California was a very different place in 1940. There were approximately 6 million people in this state. And of those, the majority were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the Midwest. And there were less than 1 million Mexicans, believe it or not, in California. Fewer, 120,000 approximately Japanese Americans, roughly another 100,000 or so Chinese Americans, around 100,000 African Americans. It was basically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant state. But look at where it is now, 50 years later, 75 years later, where are we? We're past 35, 40 million, pushing toward 50 million, and the majority of those are so-called Latinos. And 40% or so now in the schools, they're majority Latinos. But the question, people misunderstand who the Latinos are. Who are the Latinos? It's not a race. You gotta understand, Latinos are not a single race. They're a melting pot. And which melting pot? The American melting pot. Millions of people living here. These were Native Americans. And there's this mythology that somehow the Spanish came in and conquered everybody and destroyed the Indian cultures. That wasn't what did it. It was smallpox. is that all of these peoples had not been exposed to the diseases of the rest of the world. And so they were sitting ducks. They came in the space of a single lifetime, within 50 years, 90% of the Native Americans had perished. And I'm talking about chiefs and, you know, the leaders, their doctors, their lawyers, their artists, their musicians, because they had these people within the culture. Their architects, their hunters, their soldiers perished. And so people got the impression when they were coming from Europe, well, the place is empty. What do you know? It's wide open. It was made for us. God gave this to us. But as a matter of fact, it was given to the rest of the survivors on the basis of an incredible Holocaust that happened because of smallpox. Even so, peoples came to America. To replace the Native Americans, the blood and bone of Africa was brought to the Americas. And so, not just to the United States, there were more black slaves in Latin America than there were in the United States. That's not to justify slavery anywhere. But you gotta know that a place like Cuba is basically a black country. And these Cubans that you see in Miami are only part of the white middle class that left because they didn't like what was happening in Cuba. You go to Cuba and you will encounter a black country. A place like Puerto Rico has been interbred for many, many, many years. The Dominican Republic. And they produce not just baseball players. They produced all kinds of rich artists and people. But that was the first island. That's where Columbus came to roost. He came to Hispaniola, which became the Dominican Republic and became Haiti. And then there's the example of Haiti. Haiti was the first place in the world where black slaves revolted and set up and became independent and set up their own country. And as a result of that effort, way back in the 18th century, in the time of Thomas Jefferson, and the time that our country was being founded, they had the Black Revolt in Haiti because they were inspired by the American Revolution. They said, let's have our own revolution. And so they established Haiti. But as a result of that, that country was boycotted, okay? That country was cut off from the rest of the Western world. And that's why Haiti is in such a tragic state today. Despite the physical calamities, the natural calamities, the earthquakes and the hurricanes that have hit the place, the social calamity of people trying to isolate Haiti because the idea of black independence was repugnant to Western civilizations at that time. And so we are responsible for Haiti, for what Haiti is. And since where compassion kicks in, we should be more compassionate. But even on Hispaniola, Haiti shares part of the island of Hispaniola with the Dominican Republic. The Dominicans won't allow the Haitians to come in. Matter of fact, they were deporting Haitians from the Dominican Republic, and they were really judging them on the basis of appearance. If they look too black, you're off to Haiti, you know. If you're more mulatto, if you're more mestizo, if you're more blended, okay, then you can stay in the Dominican Republic. So these countries, I mean, all these countries are still suffering from a tremendous sense of ignorance about who they are and why they are, where they are. But we're talking about America. We're talking about the phenomenon of America. And I'm talking as an American playwright. I'm talking about someone who works with American workers and what the dream is and what the vision is. And so we are really invoking another vision of America. This is where globalism started. You know, when Columbus left Puerto Palos in Spain in 1492, because Ferdinand and Isabella had given him the money to construct 3 little ships, and he crossed the ocean. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, he was coming in search of China. He was trying to get to China and Japan. He didn't make it. He made it to Hispaniola. He made it to Haiti. He made it to the Dominican Republic. He made it to Puerto Rico. That's Cuba. That's as far as he got. And then he died. You know, he had a lot of troubles. And his son came after him and also tried to make it. He didn't get much far. But there were other explorers. So Magellan, for instance, and Balboa, who came all the way to around South America and discovered the Pacific. They discovered the Pacific. Finally, in 1571, approximately 80 years after Columbus arrived in the New World, 80 years, Spanish ships finally completed the journey that Columbus had started in 1492, and they got to Asia. They got to the Philippines. They got to a place called Manila, which was in the hands of the Suleiman Pasha, who was a sultan, a Muslim sultan. And there was a small settlement there called Manila. And the Chinese junks used to come from the Fujian province down, and they would bring porcelain and they would bring silk from China. And when the Spanish ships sailed and they discovered that there were Chinese artifacts for sale there, they took over Manila. They killed the Sultan and established Spanish Manila. And that became the seat then of the galleon, the Spanish galleon trade, which went on for 300 years, all the way from Manila to Acapulco, through Mexico. And so then globalism began with this trade that began coming all the way from Manila across the Pacific Ocean to Acapulco, carried by land to Mexico City, to Veracruz, and back up again to Europe. And it wasn't only Chinese silk and Chinese porcelain that was exchanged. Going in the opposite direction, the sweet potato helped to save China from starvation, in the same way that the Inca potato, developed in the high Andes in Peru, went to Europe and saved the Europeans from starving. In the same way that Aztec cotton, which they call Egyptian cotton now, okay? That's really misleading that they call it Egyptian cotton, because it's really Aztec cotton. It's a long fiber. They used to have cotton in Europe, but it was short fiber, and they couldn't really make good clothes, so the clothes in Europe were really poor. The rich could afford leather and they could afford wool, but the poor really were in rags until they imported Aztec cotton. The discovery of America brought Aztec cotton. And the fibers were so long and beautiful that it was possible for Eli Whitney to invent a machine that could weave them, the cotton gin, that could put the seeds out of the raw cotton. So if it hadn't been for Aztec cotton, which was developed by pre-Columbian ancestors, you wouldn't have the cotton gin, and Europe would not have been able to dress in cotton. The whole world, actually, in cotton. But also going in that direction, you know, the Aztecs used to grow cotton in different colors. Did you know that? It came in reds, and it came in blues, and it came in varieties of brown, without dyes, without dyes. And they just recently discovered the fact that that cotton still existed, so it's now being grown in the San Joaquin Valley. People are trying to do an end run around the dye and toxic fabric industry by using these naturally dyed cotton fabrics, you know, that came from the Aztecs. Anyway, there all kinds of exchanges happened going in both directions. You know, Chinese silk and porcelain made it all the way to the New World, and at the same time, people came. And so the first Asians that came to the Americas were the Filipinos. Not just the Filipino farm workers that made it to Delano to pick grapes and started the Delano grape strike. Their ancestors, 400 years ago, came to the Americas on Spanish galleons and made it into Mexico. And many of them stayed, thousands of them stayed. And so Mexico absorbed Filipinos and Asians into their populace, in the same way that they absorbed black people into their populace, in the same way that they've absorbed all kinds of Europeans and other Asians who started to come to the New World. So in other words, globalism began to develop in the Americas 400 or 500 years ago. And it wasn't just about cultural artifacts and food. It was about people. It was about human genes. So the so-called Latinos are not a race. The so-called Latinos are a new people that have been born out of this huge melting pot. This huge melting pot that's being created by global trade. And in all of their separate corners throughout Latin America, you know, throughout the Americas, they have had wars of independence and have tried to set up a republic the way that our founding fathers in the United States did. Because the idea of an independent government, independent of monarchies, with a representative government was a great idea. But not everybody was able to achieve it, because Latin America became a colony of the United States and was not allowed then. They needed Latin America to grow bananas. They needed Latin America to do whatever, you know, mining, tin, or gold or silver. Mexico is one of the few countries on earth that had that much gold and that much silver. And so it was exploited to the limit, you know. They took all that gold, and all that gold that was brought out of Mexico and all that silver financed the Renaissance. They never tell you that. They tell you about how great the Renaissance was in Europe. And genius artists in Europe, no question about it. But the fact is that it was financed by the circulation of Mexican gold. Mexican gold and Peruvian silver allowed the creation of capitalism in England and in the rest of the world. The world just did not have a money supply that they could rely on until the gold and silver of the Americas fed the whole world. Same thing happened in China. They could never get enough silver. Here comes Mexican silver and Peruvian silver all the way to China, and they were able to establish then a monetary trade. So when we talk about Latin America, let's talk about the phenomenon of America. The fact that it's been a global enterprise for 400 or 500 years. And so we relate to that as a teatro campesino. We're a farm workers theater. But we're a farm workers theater that knows where its feet are planted. We're planted in the ground, but we're also planted in America. And we're Americans on a continental level. You know, again, I think that it's a wonder that we, in our country, were able to develop the Constitution. And what it took to create that Constitution is a compact, it's a contract that is, people still try to violate all the time. But if we can remain true to that contract, as our founding fathers established it, the tripart electoral system, judicial and executive and legislative branches, if we can achieve that kind of balance of power, we'll continue to be the hope, you know, and of other countries too that adopt our method of government. We came out of a dark period of monarchies and dictators. Latin America has not been able to completely free itself of its dictators. Because even though they subscribed to the idea of Republican government, they were never able to achieve it. Actually, my family came as a result of the Mexican Revolution. The Chicano movement identified with the Mexican Revolution because it seemed to me that was the last time there was hope there. But Mexico is, again, not something that you can shake a stick at. Mexico is something that has continued to develop. And the Mexicans coming these days from Mexico are very different than the Mexicans that were coming 50 years ago or 100 years ago when my family came. The ones that arrived 100 years ago were the ones that were closest to the north, and they were basically campesinos. The ones that are coming now are not necessarily all campesinos. They're coming educated. They're coming from the major cities. One of the most sophisticated cities in the world is Mexico City and Guadalajara. I mean, it's there. And another one, a city of the future, is Tijuana. Believe it or not. I don't know when was the last time you went to Tijuana, but you ought to go see it now because it's growing. And it's a city of the future. And those Mexicans are very sharp. Those Mexicans are very American-oriented, very self-enterprising, and very interested, you know, in establishing their own future, creating their own future. So these are all phenomena that are happening in America. At the same time that we're still experiencing a lot of racism in different areas. You know, Black Lives Matter. We have absolutely got to prevent, we've got to educate our law enforcement officers not to shoot down people just because of the color of their skin. I think that's absolutely essential. We need police officers, yes, we need law and order in our communities, no question about that. But the idea of just this reflection, I'm going to kill a kid, you know, with a little cat gun or something, that kind of crap just has to absolutely stop. The only way it's going to stop is by social action. So I'm a cultural activist, but I'm also a political activist. And I urge you to invest in your lives by remaining active in your community, remaining active in your country. And speak out. Speak out. If you're a writer, all the more, all the better, because you can write about it. So write about it. Get on the internet and make your feelings and thoughts heard. If you're an activist, you write songs about it. You know, if you're an actor, act about it. If you're a teacher, teach about it. In every way, if you're a business person, do business about it because you can. The fact is that we all have to hang together, you know, to move together. And the future belongs to all of us collectively. And thank you. I am going to sum up here. I'm going to be speaking again tonight. You know, this is something I wanted you to see the video. But El Teatro Campesino is celebrating its 50th anniversary with a great deal of hope. And my hope is embedded in the young people, actually, that work with us. Because we start them young. Because there's always a question, to whom does the future belong? ¿A quién le pertenece el futuro? The future belongs to those that can imagine it. Thank you.